So you may have watched my global skin tutorial. If not, you should, because it took forever to make. If you have, good, because in this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you a workflow for creating a highly detailed sunbathing scene using Daz Studio, Diffeomorphic, Blender, Global Skin, Quixel Bridge, Substance Painter, and Photoshop. Did you get all that? Good. Let's begin. When I envisioned this project, it was the beginning of summer, and I wanted to create a very hot scene, both figuratively and literally. So, I start by opening up PureRef and finding some reference images. To keep things organized, I broke everything down into the main elements which I wanted to be prominent in my scene. These being what the character's body would look like, what style of bikini they would be wearing, what type of pose they would be sunbathing in, and also what types of visual effects would be on the skin. Now, before we get into Daz, I just want to quickly say that I've started a Patreon, mainly due to a smallish issue that ruined my summer. If you sign up, you'll not only be supporting me directly, but you'll also get to see what I'm working on for my next video, so please consider lending a hand. So now we find ourselves back in Daz Studio. To start, I sped up the character creation process by using some pre-made character shapes. I'm going for a sexy model vibe, so I used JS Jenny's body mixed with ICT Shahina's head. I then went into my clothing library to pick out a bikini. In my reference, I zeroed in on this girl's bikini as the style I wanted to emulate, so I picked out two pieces which I felt best fit. I then used the diffuse overlay to change the bikini's color to a pure white, as I plan to retexture them later on in Blender. Next, I applied my HD navel add-on to the character, as Daz's default belly button isn't very high quality. I then went into my body material library and used Maria 9's skin material, as it has a very nice pinkish tone. For the character's hair, I picked side-parted long bob hair, because I wanted my character to have nice, wavy long hair. If you want a full tutorial on using Daz hair in Blender, then check out this video. Next, I felt the bikini bottoms were lacking something. In my reference, I noticed that the style of bikini these models were wearing was utilizing laces, so I decided to do a little bit of kit bashing. I went into my library and grabbed another pair of bikini bottoms which had some tied laces. Then I went into the tool settings and then into the geometry editor. I then deleted all the mesh, leaving only the laces. After that, I left them as is, as later on I would be repositioning them in Blender. Now, I've finished my character. This was a pretty quick process, as I had sidestepped the more advanced character creation methods. So, let's now get into Blender with Diffeomorphic. When importing, I used the Genesis 9 preset, but I unticked the body morph settings, since this time I wasn't going to be using them, so I opted to save the memory space. Once in, I carried out all my standard setup tasks, removing transparency and adding in a new HDRI using the Easy HDRI add-on. After that, I started editing my character. I began by repositioning these laces. I start by selecting them and going into edit mode. I then separate them so they're two separate objects. I then snap the cursor to the laces knot and then move them both up so they are attached to the bikini bottoms. In the bone collections, I found that the laces also had two bones in the custom bones layer, so in edit mode, I moved them both up and lined them up. Once done, I did a quick pose test to make sure that everything was working fine. Now, let's take a look at the whole character. To the relaxed eye, you may think this looks good, but no. We still have some work to do. So let's start enhancing the character. First, I opened up my reference and took a closer look at the models. You may notice that the bikini doesn't just sit on top of the skin, but is actually cutting slightly into it, as it's fastened securely to the body with tension. To mimic this, we need to do a little bit of sculpting. I started by selecting the bikini and reducing its size slightly, so it's clipping into the body. I then went around to the back of the character and in edit mode used the proportional editor tool to push the straps in slightly. Then I selected the character and went into sculpt mode. I then grabbed the clay brush and set it to subtract. I then followed the bikini's lace around the body, adding indents to the character's mesh to simulate tension on the skin. I did the same thing for the breasts as well. After that, I went into the Bikini's modifier tab and added a solidify modifier to give it some more mass, which would reduce clipping. Moving down, in my reference, the bikini bottoms are fastened to the body with lace, but the ones I'm using have straps, so how do I make them look like lace? In sculpt mode, I select the pinch brush and then come in and pinch the mesh on the straps together. Again, in object mode, I reduce its size so it's clipping into the character. With the clay brush, I add indents to the character's body where tension would have been applied. Once done, I did some cleanup by making sure there were no gaps between the skin and the bikini. I also made some other enhancements as well. Next up, let's take a look at the breasts. In my reference, I really liked how this bikini was being worn, so I set out to mimic it. In sculpt mode, I selected the elastic grab tool, then set it to be mirrored on the x-axis. I then went in and gently pulled the bikini up and repositioned it until it roughly matched my reference. While doing this, I found that the lace on the bikini was too wobbly, so I removed some of the edge loops to make it more straight and tight. After that, I did some last-minute cleanup, which involved making some of the lace straps thinner and reducing the size of the knots on the bikini bottoms. Once I was satisfied, I then moved on to the next stage, being posing. I selected my character's armature and then opened up my posing library. In there, I went into my sunbathing pose folder and had a scroll through. In my reference board, I put together a collection of poses which I felt best suited the vibe. As these were Genesis 8 poses, I used Diffeomorphic's pose conversion setting to make them compatible with Genesis 9. Once applied, I added in a basic plane so the character had some ground to sit on. I then set up two basic camera angles, being a wide shot and a close-up. I also adjusted my Easy HDRI add-on, so I had some basic side lighting to work with. Let's take a look at the hair. If you've seen my Daz hair tutorial, then you will know that I actually rigged this hair asset so I would be able to pose it later on. For clean-looking hair, set the light paths to full global illumination with transparency at 100. Remember though, this will be very performance heavy. In pose mode, I reposition the hair bones so it's hanging over her shoulders. I also noticed that the new pose had also made the bikini slightly wonky, so I made a few corrections. Next, I needed to build the environment. I started by getting some sand for the ground, so I opened up Quixel Bridge and looked at what sand materials they had. Eventually, I settled on this rippled sand material, which would be a great fit for my beach. I imported that material into my Blender scene, and then applied it to my plane. I needed to add the ripples to the sand. This is done using a displacement map. There are several ways to do this, but this is the method I like to use. First, I select the plane and go to the texture icon in my Properties tab. If this icon is missing, then just open the texture painting workspace and it will magically appear. In there, I select New and then go to Open. I then navigate to my Ripple Sand Materials folder and then select the Sands Displacement Map. I select my plane, and in the Modifiers tab, I add in a Displace modifier. I then set the modifier to use the displacement texture. I add in a subdivision modifier and increase its levels. In the displacement modifier, I adjusted the strength. Make sure the subdivision modifier is at the top of your stack, otherwise you will not see any changes. You'll have some issues at first, one being that the polygons have hard edges, the other being that the subdivisions are turning the plane into a circle. To fix the circle issue, add in another subdivision modifier, put that at the top of the stack, and set it to simple. The more levels you add to the simple subdivision, the more square the plane will become. To remove the hard edges, in edit mode, I face select the plane and then go to face and then shade smooth to soften everything. In Cycles, I played around with the modifier's resolution, as the viewport can trick you into overcompensating. Remember, the material's normal map will do most of the work. Once I had the right resolution, I adjusted the displacement's height until it fit the character. I then repositioned the plane so the ripples in the sand weren't clipping directly into her. Now I need to create a horizon, which means turning this plane into a grid, which will extend into the horizon. To do this efficiently, I make a linked duplicate. This means all my planes will be using the same data, so they're basically all identical clones. Linked duplicates can also have different modifier settings, so I can set the distant planes to use half the resolution compared to the ones at the front. Now, I need a background. To do this, I'm going to use a little trick called rear projection. I grab a simple image of a beach, then I add in a plane and place it behind the character. In the object properties, I go to the ray visibility and untick everything except the camera, so the background image has no effect on the scene other than visual. To make the background brighter, I plug the image texture into the emissive value and increase the strength. I then reposition the background so it fits the perspective of my close-up camera. Now, I can start experimenting with the camera's depth of field. For this video, I'm going to be using the Photographer add-on, which is really useful for giving you quick and easy access to the camera's settings. Applying depth of field is not only great for giving you a cinematic look, but it also blurs out imperfections in your background. Remember, keep blurred out elements low poly to increase performance. Now, it's time to do some lighting. I start by cycling through my hastier eyes, trying to find a good color palette, as well as a direction for the direct sunlight. I played around with the saturation and the tint values to see if anything stuck out. Eventually, I settled on this desert environment, which had nice bright lighting and harsh shadows, which was perfect for my beach scene. Next up, I wanted her to be lying on a towel, so I went into Daz and grabbed this SY deforced towel, which has a displacement modifier to simulate microfiber. Once imported into Blender, I did a test to make sure the displacement effect was working. Then, I gave the towel a solidify modifier to increase its mass. After that, I copied and pasted it into my scene and placed it under my character. Right now, the towel looks kind of bland, so let's add some enhancements. First, I made the towel white so it would stand out. Then, I selected the sand and turned its modifiers off, so I had a nice flat surface to work with. Now, I need to add some folds to the towel, so I go into sculpt mode and select the blend twist cloth brush and started making some folds. Also, make sure to turn off your subdivision modifier, otherwise the deformation will be laggy. Once I've laid in some nice folds, I turn the sand's displacement back on. Now I need to make some corrections. First, I made sure the towel's folds were sitting on top of the surface of the sand. Next, I had to remove the sand which was clipping through the towel, so I first unlinked the plane's vertex data so it would be a standalone object. I then applied the sample modifier. Now, I could use the clay brush to push the clipping sand underneath the towel. I then finished up with some light polish and then moved on to the next step, the skin. I won't go into too much detail on the global skin process, as I've already made a half-hour video breaking down how to use that add-on. For those who have not seen that video, global skin is a highly detailed, highly realistic skin material which you can apply to your Daz character very quickly. To use it efficiently, I use value nodes placed inside groups, which are then pasted into Global Skin's body part materials. This allows me to make changes to the entire character by literally just changing one value. I wanted the character to look tanned, so I used the saturation and the gamma to achieve that effect. I then adjusted the specular and the roughness, so the skin looks very shiny, as if she's applied lotion. Lastly, I adjusted the weights node, which is basically the normal map for the skin's wrinkles. While playing around with the global skin values, I realized that the towel could actually do with some subsurface scattering, as the fabric looked a bit like plastic. So I went over to the towel's principal BSDF and set the weight to 0.1 and the radius values all to 1, so the towel could refract its own color. After that, I took some time to let the cycles render, so I could get a clearer look at the character. I felt the legs were a bit too shiny and distracting. But the problem was, if I disconnected the roughness group on the leg's material, a seam would appear where the material ended. To fix this, I decided to cut the torso material in half and use the bikini bottoms to strategically hide the seam. I face selected the lower half of the torso, and then made that a unique material. I then set up a unique roughness and specular group node, so it would only affect the legs and the lower torso. Once done, I adjusted the values until I got the legs to look just right. Next, it was time to give her a hat and some sunglasses. So in Daz, I laid out some beach hat props and a pair of aviator sunglasses, which I then imported into Blender. To attach the hats, I first copied the character's pose, and then I reset her back to the T-pose. I then put every hat on her head, and then parented them all to the upper neck bone. I then repasted the sunbathing pose. Next, I swapped out each hat until I found one which best suited the vibe. This ended up being this overly large, weaved hat, which I felt did a good job casting a nice, wide shadow over the character's body, framing her face. In the hat's materials, I used the hue saturation node to change its color to white. Then, I used the proportional editor to readjust the hat's brim so it's hiding her forehead. I also made the hat's bow a solid red. I took a look at the sunglasses, as I wanted them to stand out, so I opted to make them a solid mirror white to draw the viewer's attention to the character's face. I then did some light adjustments on the hat, using the proportional editor tool. I needed to make the hair fit the hat, as it was currently clipping through the top. To fix this, I first duplicated the hair's collection, and then hid the original. I went to edit mode and used the lasso select tool to draw a selection around the hair cards, which were clipping. I then deleted the excess mesh, so now the hair looks like it's underneath the hat. Next, I made a light enhancement to the hat by giving it a little bit of subsurface scattering. Now, I'm going to make a more ambitious change. As the hat is weaved, in my reference, you can see that little spots of sunlight are poking through the hat onto the character's skin, so I set out to mimic that. What I do first is select the hat's normal map, and then plug that into the material's alpha input. I then drop in a color ramp node. This allows me to fine-tune the gaps in the hat so I can mimic the gaps in the weaving. After some fiddling, I eventually got the result I was looking for. I then went into the compositor and experimented with the Better Bloom node to see how well it could enhance my scene. It helped wash out the shadows, giving a nice harsh sunlight feel. I felt the bikini bottoms looked a little floaty, so I increased the mass with the Solidify modifier and used the Sculpt brush to make some minor corrections. The character was a little too pale, so I made a group for the global skin stains value to make the skin more orange. I also wanted to add some light reddish tones to the character's arms to mimic a light sunburn, so I made a group for the skin weights values and set the RGB node to red. Now, it's time to make some custom changes. Because she's sunbathing on a sandy beach, it would only be natural that she would get some sand stuck on her skin. So to mimic that, I decided to make my own custom sand texture overlay. To do this, I will first have to import the character into Substance Painter. First, I select the character's body and her clothing. Then, I export as an OBJ. Note, make sure selection only is ticked, otherwise you'll export the whole scene. Now, I open up Substance Painter and drag and drop that OBJ in. Make sure the resolution is set to 4K. When I first imported this, I found that the split torso material had also transferred into Substance Painter. This could complicate things when I start painting in textures, so I went back into Blender and temporarily remerged the torso. Once re-imported, I did a quick test to make sure everything was working fine. To make things easier, I decided to give the character a basic texture, so I went and found my Maria 9 color map textures and then dragged and dropped them onto my character in Substance Painter. I then removed the roughness, so I had a nice and clean texture. Now, let's add some sand to her skin. I go into the Substance Material library and pick out this ground sand material. Substance Painter acts very similar to Photoshop, as what I can do is create a group and then add that material onto it. Then I add a black mask to that group. Now I can go into my brush library and use white paint to reveal the sand material on top of the character's body. Getting this just right requires some experimenting, but eventually I found this dirt brush which did the job. I then went into the sand's material settings and adjusted the values, so it was less bright. Using my reference, I changed it so it was less ripply and looked more like dirt. The seams in the material were a bit of a challenge, but I was able to blend them together quite well. I then went around the character, copying that group into each material, and then repainting the sand. Once I had a rough texture, I decided to import it into Blender. First, I disabled the Maria 9 color map for every material, as I only want the sand texture for my overlay. Then, I went to File and selected Export Textures. In there, you'll get a menu showing all your materials, most importantly, the platform formats you can export to. I started by disabling the materials I was not using. I then changed the output to use a texture folder I created in my content folder. I want this texture to be an overlay, so I'm going to set up an alpha map. The problem with the standard Blender output is that its alpha map is using a black and white mask, while I want to use a transparent PNG format. So I'm going to have to edit this Blender output. First, I go into the output templates, then select the Blender preset. I then duplicate it and call it Blender Alpha. In this new preset, I delete the RGB color texture and then add in an RGB plus A texture. I then add the base color map to the RGB and the A. Now with this new texture format, I can export the color map with a transparent background. Before I export, I disable the metallic emission and alpha maps for each material output, as these will be blank. Now I can export. After it's done, I can go into my texture folder and view them. I then make sure that the color map has a transparent background. Back in my Blender scene, I select my torso material, then import the textures for that material into its node tree. I then create a principal BSDF and hook my textures up to it. The displacement map will come in useful later, but for now, I left it alone. Next, I added a mix shader as the final node before the material output. I then connect the principal BSDF and the global skin to that mix shader. Now, to get the overlay to work, I go to my Sans, Base Colors, Alpha, and drag that into the mix shader's fact. I then put a color ramp in front of it. The color ramp will allow me to fine-tune the amount of sand on the character, as well as how sharp it will be. Lastly, to use the displacement map, I add in a mix vector. Then I connect the global skin height map and the displacement map to it. I then plug my color ramp into its fact. This will create a mask between the two height maps. Next, I add in a hue saturation node to the displacement map, so I could reduce its intensity. I wanted to make the sand less reflective, so I also added a color ramp to the roughness and changed the white value to a dark gray. Now that I have set up this overlay's node cluster, I now need to get it into other materials. So, I simply copy all the nodes, then paste them into the other body part materials. Once pasted in, I then connect everything to the mix shader and the mix vector. Now, all I have to do is swap out the Substance Painter torso textures for the ones for the corresponding limbs. Once I have set up these textures, I can then do a little trick. If I return to Substance Painter and make some corrections, and then export again, those changes will automatically update to the character. After some experimenting and trial and error, I eventually settled on a look I liked. Next, I wanted to add another overlay to my character. This time, it was going to be tan lines. So I go into Substance Painter and add in another group to the Layers tab. I then add in a fill layer and set it to red. I then add a mask to the group and then use the tapered brush to basically add an outline to the skin underneath the bikini. Once I was done, I changed the fill layer to white and then I went into the export menu. I disable every layer except the base color. Then, I made sure to create a separate texture folder, so it would not override my sand texture's color map when exporting. Once exported, I renamed it to avoid any overriding issues. Like with the sand texture, I imported it into my torso's material and set up a principal BSDF and a mix shader, then used the alpha input and a color ramp to create an overlay. To change the color of the tan lines, I used the color ramp and the hue saturation node to fine-tune it. I also made some minor corrections in Substance Painter so the tan lines were a little thinner. Now, I wanted to add some sweat to my character. If you've watched my global skin video, then you would have seen me set up this WetFX overlay. To save time, I copy that character into my scene and simply copy and paste the WetFX node group into my torso material and hook it up. If you feel the WetFX mask is set up incorrectly, then disconnect the input into the mix shader. That will create a black background, which will allow you to see how well the color ramp is projecting the mask. Next, I wanted the WetFX overlay to use its droplet texture, so I used the file icon on the image texture node. This opened the WetFX's texture folder. I then selected a new texture to replace it. After some adjustments, I felt it looked good on the black background, so I reconnected the mix shader. Looking at it, I felt the droplets were a little invisible, so I experimented with tinting the color of the water with the hue saturation node. Eventually, I settled on a light orange tint, which allowed for some droplets to stand out under the shadows, while also not being too out the ordinary. Now, the character materials are pretty much done. Let's now give this bikini a little bit of texture. First, I wanted to create a rim outline around the bikini, similar to this design on my reference. So I edge selected around the rim of the bikini, and then made a cut to create a seam. I then face selected the border section and the lace straps, and then made a material copy, which I then applied to that section. I then followed the exact same steps on the bikini bottoms, creating a rim and then making a material copy. Now, I wanted to add a new texture to the bikini, so I opened up Blanket and scrolled through all the fabric materials which had a pattern on them. I eventually found one, which I then imported directly onto my bikini's material. When you import a blend kit material, it can sometimes automatically change your UV map. To fix this, in the Data tab, go to the UV Maps drop-down menu, and then change that back to default UVs. After that, I used the Materials Mapping node to resize and reposition it until I got the result I wanted. Looking at it, I felt something was missing, so I highlighted all the nodes and copied them. I then swapped the pattern's material back to the bikini's original material. Then, I pasted the pattern's nodes into that material. You can see that the pattern's nodes have a material output. You can click on it to make the material use that output instead of the original one. All I want from the bikini's original material is the normal map, so I drag a connection from that to the normal map slot for the pattern. I then repeat the same steps for the bikini bottoms. I also made the pattern diagonal, as it looked really nice on my close-up camera view. Now, I need to recolor the bikini. To do this, I used a color ramp in a group to change the color of both the bikini and the bikini bottoms simultaneously. Next up, I wanted to add a pattern to the towel. For this, I went into Google Images and found a nice pattern to use. I then just dragged and dropped that into my towel's material and then hooked it up with a mix node set to multiply. I then used Node Wrangler to create a mapping node. I then repositioned the texture until I had a nice pattern overlay on my towel. I then added a color ramp node to change its color palette. Now, all my elements were in place, so I took some time to look at it and think about what worked and what did not. I decided to change the bikini to blue, as the red was not contrasting with the body. Once I made that simple change, the character really started to pop, as I now had two contrasting elements, which balanced out the scene. Finally, my character needed an expression, so I first adjusted the neck so it was leaning forward slightly. I then went into the Daz runtime menu and played around with the different expressions. Eventually, I settled on this sly, flirty smile, which I felt really sold my character's personality. At this point, I was really close to doing a render, but I had one more issue, which was that the hair was too dark and needed a little bit of shine. To fix this, I created two area lights and used the light link menu so they would only affect the hair. This then allowed me to give the hair some artificial shine without affecting the rest of the character. Now, it's time to do a render. It's always best to do a test render first on your hair by crop rendering a small section and rendering it to see how long it will take. If you feel it's taking too long, lower your samples or your light path transparency level. Lastly, I used my final check add-on to hide any unwanted elements and then did a full render. Once that had finished, I then went into my compositor. This is where I prep my render for editing in Photoshop. Like with my other videos, I want to denoise the hair so it's nice and smooth, so I use a Kurohara node with an anti-aliasing node. I then save several renders with different strengths. Now, let's get ourselves into Photoshop. First, I sharpen the render to remove any soft edges. I then add in the Kurohara renders. I then use a mask to reveal sections of these renders on top of my original render's hair to remove the noise and make the hair smooth. Next, I need to make some minor corrections. I create a new layer, then I use the stamp brush set to use all layers. I then toned down the glint in her eyes. Next, I add in a bunch of color lookup filters to experiment with different values. I noticed that the sunglasses were reflecting a little bit of her hair. This made them look a little dirty. So I went back into Blender and did a crop render on the glasses. I then hid the hair. In the glasses material, I also increased the metallic value to make the lenses more clean. I then rendered the result and pasted that render into Photoshop. I then used a mask to reveal that new render on top of the original sunglasses to hide the imperfections. After that, I continued experimenting with the filters and the tone. I felt the eyes were a little too dark, so I made a new layer and put some white paint on top of them. I then changed the layer's blend mode to soft light and used the opacity to make the effect more subtle. Looking at the bikini, I felt it needed to be sharper than the body, as the fabric stitching was not standing out. So, I created a duplicate of my clean renders layer and masked out the bikini. I then added some more sharpening. Next, I used the stamp tool to cover over some of the loose hair cards which were poking out of the side of the character. I also noticed that some of the droplets on the character's body had been stretched by the pose, so I removed some of the more egregious ones. I then played around with the values some more. I felt something was missing, so I decided to separate the character from the background by using the lasso tool to make a mask. This allowed me to have a color lookup filter for the background and one for the character. I also made one for the hat as well, to make it glow. Looking at the shadows, I felt they needed to be more red, so I made another mask just for that, and used a vibrance layer to increase its saturation. By this point, I needed to call it, so I did a copy merge on the whole thing and then pasted. To finalize it, I add a little bit of noise to give the final result some authenticity. And now, I'm done. I felt this came out really nice, especially the contrast between the blue and red tones. Plus, the grimy visual effects on the body really helped make the character pop. Thanks for watching. This little mini-series was a little more intense than I thought it would be, so please support me on Patreon. I'll be cooking up something very special and close to my heart for my next video, so please stay tuned.